He inherited the Apache leader's 2 wives. What the cowboy faced next was unbelievable. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind carried the dry breath of the desert, whispering through brittle sagebrush and rattling the bones of old fence posts long since surrendered to the dust. A lone cowboy rode across that endless stretch, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of powder that swirled in the hot, shimmering air. In his coat pocket was a folded letter, the paper brittle and stained from travel. The words inside had been penned in a shaky hand, yet the urgency in them had been unmistakable. It was from Gray Hawk, the Apache leader the cowboy had known in years past. The message had been short, too short, saying only that death was near, and that the cowboy must come at once. It spoke of a matter that could not wait, a matter involving his 2 wives who would be left alone once he was gone. The cowboy shifted in the saddle, his mind turning over the strange weight of the request. Why him? He was no blood kin, no tribal member. His only tie to Gray Hawk came from an uneasy alliance years earlier when the 2 had stood on the same side against a gang of horse thieves. That was a story best left to the past, yet it seemed the old chief hadn't forgotten. The thought of riding into an Apache camp uninvited was dangerous enough, but doing it to answer a dying man's call was something else entirely. Still, there was something in those words, a gravity he could not ignore. By midday, the desert sun was a white eye glaring down from above, draining the world of color. The cowboy's canteen was half empty, and his shirt clung damp to his back. He kept riding toward the far-off rise where jagged red cliffs cut into the horizon. Somewhere beyond those rocks lay Gray Hawk's camp. The ride was long and lonely, with only the caw of a distant raven and the crunch of gravel beneath his horse's hooves to keep him company. More than once, he caught sight of movement on the ridges, small, fleeting shapes that vanished before he could study them. Whether they were scouts from the Apache camp or something less friendly, he couldn't tell. As the day began to lean toward evening, he finally reached the edge of the camp. It sat nestled in a shallow basin, sheltered from the wind by sandstone walls. The place was quiet, too quiet. Warriors stood along the perimeter, their faces painted in solemn colors, their eyes following him with a mixture of recognition and suspicion. The air was heavy with the scent of sage smoke from the fires, curling upward in thin, ghostly trails. The cowboy dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible, and waited for one of them to approach. A tall warrior with a beaded lance stepped forward, studying him for a long moment before speaking. "Gray Hawk waits for you," he said, his voice low but steady. The cowboy gave a small nod, holding his horse's reins as he followed the man deeper into camp. Women moved silently between hide tents, tending to fires and carrying water, their expressions unreadable. Somewhere, a drum thudded a slow, steady beat that seemed to match the pounding in the cowboy's chest. They came to a large lodge at the center of the camp. Inside, the air was warm and dim, lit only by a small fire in the center and shafts of light filtering through the smoke hole. The smell of herbs, sage, cedar, and something bitter, hung thick. There, lying on a bed of furs, was Gray Hawk. The old man's frame had withered, his once broad shoulders now thin beneath the woven blanket that covered him. His breath came slow and labored, and a cough rattled through him as the cowboy stepped closer. For a moment the old chief's eyes were closed, but then they opened and a faint light sparked within them. "You came," he rasped, his voice a dry wind through stone. The cowboy tipped his hat in greeting, unsure of what words would fit this moment. Gray Hawk motioned for him to sit beside the bed. "I am leaving this world soon," he said, the words broken by another cough. "When I am gone there will be no one to stand for them, my wives. Without my protection they will be taken, traded, or worse. You owe me nothing, yet I ask you to take them. Keep them safe. Take them away from here." The cowboy's jaw tightened. This was more than a request, it was a burden, one that could draw the wrath of any who sought to claim the women. "Why me?" he asked quietly. The chief's lips curved into a tired smile. "Because you are a man who keeps his word. And because there is no one else who can walk in both worlds." Outside, the drumbeat grew slower, deeper, as if marking the fading moments of the old man's life. The cowboy looked at Gray Hawk, at the lines carved into his face by years of wind, war, and sun, and he felt the weight of history between them. Accepting meant putting himself between the women and whatever dangers might come. Refusing, well, that wasn't something he could do, not to a man whose life he once saved, and who had saved his in return. Still he hesitated. "If I take them, others might come after us," he said. "They will," Gray Hawk replied simply. "But you will be ready." The fire crackled softly, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally the cowboy gave a small nod. "I'll do it." The chief's shoulders relaxed and a faint peace came over his face. "Then I can leave this world without fear," he said. He reached beside his bed and lifted a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. Inside was a spear, its shaft carved with intricate patterns, and a beaded blanket heavy with turquoise and shells. "These are for you. Symbols of your promise." The cowboy accepted them in silence, feeling the weight of more than just the objects. He glanced toward the lodge entrance where two figures now stood. The first was a tall woman with proud eyes and long braids bound with red cloth. The second was younger, her gaze downcast, her posture wary. Both wore buckskin dresses adorned with beadwork that caught the dim light. They said nothing, but the air between them carried the unspoken knowledge of what had just been decided. Outside, the sun was sinking low, spilling gold across the desert and setting the sandstone walls ablaze in fiery color. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its cry long and lonely. The cowboy knew this was only the beginning, and that whatever road lay ahead would be hard and dangerous. But he also knew he wouldn't turn back now. The night came quietly, but with a heaviness that pressed down on the camp like an unseen hand. The air had turned cooler after the sun's descent, yet the stillness carried no comfort. Somewhere, far beyond the sandstone walls, a lone night bird called, its voice sharp against the silence. Inside the great lodge, Greyhawk's breathing had grown shallow, each exhale a frail whisper. The cowboy stood just outside, the flickering light of the central fire throwing his shadow long against the dirt. He didn't have to look inside to know the old chief's time had come. He could feel it in the stillness of the warriors gathered nearby, in the way the women tending the fires moved slower, as though marking time until the last breath was taken. When it happened, it was without fanfare. One moment, the rattling breaths carried through the lodge, and the next there was nothing but the pop of firewood. A soft wail rose from within, low at first, then growing into a mournful cry that seemed to pierce the desert night. The cowboy removed his hat and bowed his head. Around him, the warriors closed their eyes, murmuring words in a language he only partly understood, words meant to guide a man's spirit to the other side. Before long, the camp moved with quiet purpose. Torches were lit, casting warm halos of light against the cold blue of moonlit rock. The burial would be swift, for such was their way. The body, wrapped in a thick blanket heavy with beads and feathers, was carried by 4 warriors toward the small rise overlooking the camp. The cowboy followed, walking behind the 2 women who now stood at the center of his new and uncertain path. The older one walked with a straight spine, her head high, the silver strands in her braids catching the moonlight. Her eyes were fierce, scanning the darkness beyond the torchlight, as if daring any spirit, living or dead, to challenge her place here. The younger woman was a shadow beside her, eyes lowered, each step taken with measured caution. She clutched a strip of leather in her hand, twisting it over and over, her fingers pale in the torchlight. They reached the gravesite, a mound of earth softened by wild grass. The chief's spear was planted upright at the head, the beaded blanket laid over the body before it was lowered into the earth. A priest of the tribe began chanting, his deep voice rolling in a steady rhythm, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the bones. The women stood at the edge of the grave, their faces turned to the moon, and in that pale glow the cowboy saw it. The older woman's gaze was sharp, unblinking, as if she had already accepted whatever came next. The younger's was different, shuddered, haunted, carrying something she would not speak aloud. When the last of the earth was packed and the chanting ceased, the camp gathered in a wide circle. From the shadows, the tall warrior who had first greeted the cowboy stepped forward, carrying something wrapped in deerskin. He stopped before the cowboy, unwrapping the bundle with deliberate care. Inside lay the ceremonial spear, its shaft polished smooth, the carvings along its length telling the story of Greyhawk's life. His battles, his hunts, his victories. The warrior placed it in the cowboy's hands. Another man approached, carrying the beaded blanket, its weight surprising as it was draped over the cowboy's arm. The beads were cool under his fingers, their patterns intricate, speaking of generations of craft and meaning. Finally, the 2 women stepped forward together. No words were spoken, but their presence was clear enough. This was the final gift and the heaviest. The older woman's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. The younger kept her gaze down, though he caught the brief flicker of her eyes, just long enough to see the guarded wariness there. The circle of warriors closed around them, and a murmur passed through the crowd, low voices, not quite whispers, carrying on the desert air. Though he couldn't make out every word, the tone was unmistakable. This was not the inheritance they had expected. Some voices carried skepticism, others a thin thread of warning. He felt the shift in the air, the way some eyes lingered too long on the women, the way others narrowed at him. The cowboy stood tall, though the weight of the gifts felt heavier than anything he had carried before. The spear in his hand wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol that he was now bound to the chief's last wish. The blanket wasn't just adornment, it was a shield meant to protect those now under his care. And the women weren't just companions, they were living promises, each with her own truth and danger. As the ceremony broke apart, the older wife moved to his side, her steps deliberate, her voice low. "They will test you," she said in accented English, the words clipped and certain. "They will see if you are strong enough to keep us." The younger said nothing. She lingered a few steps behind, her face hidden in the shadow of her hair, though the cowboy could feel her watchfulness like a quiet pressure at his back. She seemed to move in a world of her own, detached from the camp, from him, even from the older wife. Back at the lodge set aside for them, the cowboy laid the gifts carefully against the wall. The fire burned low, its light catching the patterns in the beadwork. He sat with his back to the post, turning the spear in his hands, tracing the grooves with his thumb. Each carved mark told a story, yet it was the blank space at the bottom that drew his attention. It was empty, waiting for the next chapter to be added. Outside, the camp settled into uneasy silence. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote howled, its cry answered by another farther away. The older wife lay down on one side of the lodge, her posture still rigid, as if even in rest she refused to bend. The younger sat by the fire, her hands in her lap, staring at the flames as though searching for something in them. The cowboy closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. The words of the older wife echoed in his mind, "They will test you." He had no doubt she was right. This inheritance was more than he had bargained for, and already in the quiet hours before dawn, he could feel the first stirrings of the trouble to come. The desert stretched out before them in an unbroken sweep of gold and red, the horizon wavering in the heat like the surface of some restless sea. The cowboy rode at the front, reins loose in his hands but eyes scanning every distant ridge. Behind him, the two women followed on separate horses, their dark hair catching the sunlight in brief glimmers. The older wife sat straight-backed, her expression carved from stone, while the younger kept her gaze lowered, her posture guarded. It had been less than 2 days since they'd left the Apache camp, yet the air already felt charged as if danger were riding alongside them, just out of sight. By late afternoon the signs began. At first it was nothing more than a faint shimmer on the far ridge, the kind of heat-distorted shape that could be mistaken for a trick of the sun. But as the light shifted, the cowboy caught the movement, a rider still as a statue watching them from afar. No dust cloud, no charge, just a silent sentinel against the sky. When he turned to look again, the ridge was empty. He said nothing, but his hand brushed against the butt of his revolver out of habit. The older wife noticed. She rode up beside him, her voice low so the younger would not hear. "They are watching us," she said in a tone that wasn't fearful, only certain. "The ones who wanted us after his death. They will not give up so easily." Her words carried no drama, only the cool resignation of someone who had seen the pattern of such hunts before. She went on to explain that among the rival warriors, taking the widows of a fallen chief was more than possession. It was a way of absorbing his strength, his honor, his legacy. To lose them to an outsider, a white cowboy no less, was a humiliation they would not bear quietly. The cowboy said nothing, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. He knew enough about pride, Apache or otherwise, to understand how far men might go to defend it. As the day wore on, the sky began to change. Clouds built in low, bruised streaks, casting long shadows across the plains. Far ahead, vultures wheeled lazily, black specks against the dimming light. The cowboy's eyes followed them until they dipped behind a ridge. He didn't need to see what was drawing them. His gut told him it was nothing good. When the sun set, they made camp near a narrow dry creek bed, sheltered by a stand of twisted mesquite trees. The younger wife moved quickly to gather firewood, her movements efficient but silent, never meeting his gaze. The older one sat cross-legged by the fire pit, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the flickering circle of light. The cowboy began to notice something about the younger woman. Each time the older spoke certain names, her shoulders would stiffen almost imperceptibly. She would not look toward the ridges, but he could feel her mind there, as if listening for footsteps that had yet to come. They ate in silence. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of wood smoke from somewhere else, a campfire that wasn't theirs. The cowboy set his tin plate aside and walked a slow circle around their camp, eyes adjusting to the moonlit dark. In the distance, far enough to be safe but close enough to be deliberate, he saw it. A small fire, its glow pulsing faintly like an ember in the belly of the night. He returned to the fire and began quietly checking his rifle. The older wife's eyes followed his every motion, but she said nothing. The younger kept her head bowed. Then the older spoke, her voice as steady as the crackle of the flames. "If they come, they will come fast. And they will come at night." The cowboy gave a small nod. "Then I'll be ready." It happened near midnight. The moon had drifted behind a thick sheet of clouds, and the desert lay in almost complete darkness. The cowboy sat with his back to a mesquite trunk, rifle resting across his knees, listening to the quiet, and then the quiet broke. A faint rustle, the whisper of leather against leather, the creak of a saddle. He was on his feet before the sound could grow louder. From the blackness, shadows surged forward. 3 riders, their ponies quick and sure-footed, arrows glinting in the dim light. The older wife shouted something in Apache, a warning, but the attackers didn't falter. The cowboy swung his rifle up in a single motion, his breath steady, his mind narrowing to the space between heartbeats. The first shot cracked through the night, a burst of flame at the muzzle. One rider pitched sideways off his horse, the thud of his body swallowed by the sand. The second shot came before the echo of the first had died, this one striking the horse of another attacker, sending both man and beast tumbling into the dust. The third warrior veered off, loosing an arrow that hissed past the cowboy's shoulder before disappearing into the dark. The younger wife had dropped to the ground, hands over her head. The older stood tall, gripping the ceremonial spear as if she intended to meet death head-on. The cowboy chambered another round and scanned the horizon, but the third rider was already gone, swallowed by the same shadows that had delivered him. The camp fell silent again, save for the ragged breathing of horses and the faint hiss of the dying fire. The cowboy lowered his rifle, his eyes still on the darkness. "They'll be back," the older wife said after a long moment. He nodded. "I know." The younger wife slowly rose to her feet, brushing sand from her skirt. For the first time she looked directly at him, her eyes sharp and searching, as if trying to decide whether he was truly capable of keeping them alive. She said nothing, but in that silent exchange the cowboy understood something. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of something else entirely. He didn't press her. There would be time for questions later. For now, he stoked the fire back to life, the orange glow pushing against the darkness like a fragile shield. Somewhere out there, riders waited, watching, deciding when to strike again. And as the cowboy settled back into his place by the mesquite, rifle close at hand, he knew the road ahead would be far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The canyon walls rose like silent sentinels around their small camp, their jagged shadows stretching long in the flickering glow of the fire. The river murmured softly nearby, its gentle rush a strange comfort after the chaos of the day's ambush. The cowboy sat cross-legged by the flames, his rifle leaning against a rock within easy reach, the metal catching faint glints of orange light. His chest still heaved from the fight, his muscles sore and his knuckles raw from the struggle. Across from him, the 2 women sat close together, their faces half lit by the fire, half claimed by darkness. The older wife, her posture rigid as ever, dabbed a cloth at the younger woman's arm where a shallow cut from an arrow had drawn blood. Neither of them had spoken much since the attack. The older wife, whose eyes held the weight of decades of survival, finally broke the silence. Her voice was low and steady, carrying the cadence of someone who had seen too many hard seasons to be rattled by one more. She spoke of the tribe's long battle with outsiders, settlers who came for land, soldiers who came for control, and rival tribes who came for vengeance. Her words painted pictures of burning camps, blood on snow, and leaders forced to choose between war and surrender. She told of how the late chief had held the people together through sheer will, forging uneasy truces with enemies, and why his death had created a void large enough for chaos to seep in. The cowboy listened, the fire's heat warming his skin but doing little to ease the cold sinking into his gut. Every sentence confirmed what he had already begun to sense. Inheriting the chief's wives was not an honor, not a gift. It was a burden strapped to his back, one that could drag him into conflicts he had no stake in. And yet, somewhere deep inside he knew he couldn't walk away. When the older wife fell silent, her gaze shifted to the younger woman beside her. She had been quiet all night, her head bowed as though the firelight itself might reveal too much. The older wife murmured something in Apache, and the younger woman's shoulders stiffened. Slowly she raised her eyes to the cowboy. There was fear there but also something harder, a steeliness that came from years of keeping truths locked away. "I was not born to the Apache," she said finally, her voice trembling at first, then gaining strength. The cowboy's brows knit, but he kept his mouth shut, sensing that if he interrupted, the fragile moment might shatter. When I was a child, maybe 6 years old, my family's ranch was raided. It was near the borderlands, far from any fort or town. I remember fire, screaming, and then nothing but riding for days in the arms of a stranger. The chief's wife, she took me in, raised me as her own. I learned their language, their ways. But I have always known. I was not one of them. Her words fell like stones into the silence. The cowboy glanced toward the older wife, whose eyes were fixed on the flames. The younger woman continued, her voice steadier now, as though once the gate had opened, there was no stopping what would come out. They say my real parents were killed in that raid. But there are rumors, whispers I've overheard, that not all of my family died. Some believe I am the missing daughter of a rancher, a man with land stretching farther than the eye can see. If it's true, then I am worth more than gold to the right people. The cowboy leaned back, the firelight dancing in his narrowed eyes. It made sense now, the way the rival warriors had attacked so fiercely, not just to kill but to capture. If her story was true, then she was not simply a part of the inheritance. She was a bargaining chip in a game of power and greed. A missing heiress, hidden among the Apache for years, now suddenly vulnerable after the chief's death. The older wife finally spoke again, confirming his thoughts. The men who hunt us, they know of her blood. They will not stop until they have her, for ransom or revenge. The weight of it pressed down on him. This was no longer about a promise made to a dying man. It was about survival, theirs and his. He thought of his homestead miles away, a place that had once seemed isolated and safe. Now he saw it in his mind's eye, surrounded by riders, its fields burning, the sound of gunfire echoing through the hills. Bringing them there might not be protection at all, it could be leading danger straight to his own doorstep. The younger woman's eyes met his again, and in them he saw a plea she didn't voice aloud. She wanted him to believe her, to keep her safe. But there was something else, a flicker of mistrust, as though she wasn't entirely certain which side of this tangled story he would fall on. He couldn't blame her. Trust was a rare commodity out here, worth more than bullets. The fire popped, sending a burst of sparks swirling upward toward the dark canyon sky. The cowboy reached for his rifle and checked the chamber, the motion smooth and practiced. "We move at first light," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But before we ride, you're going to tell me every name you know. Every place you've been. If someone's after you, I aim to see them coming before they get within 100 yards. The older wife gave a small nod, almost a sign of approval. The younger one hesitated, then nodded as well. The truth was out now, and with it came a different kind of silence, not the strained quiet of secrets, but the heavy pause before a storm breaks. That night, as the others slept, the cowboy stayed awake by the fire, watching the shadows twist and shift across the canyon walls. Somewhere out there, riders were hunting them. Somewhere, the next move in this deadly game was already being planned. And as the embers burned low, he realized the inheritance was not just the women or the spear or the blanket. It was the enemies that came with them. And they were coming fast. The sun was sinking low when the three of them crested the final ridge and looked down upon the cowboy's ranch. The place had once been his pride, a wide stretch of land framed by cottonwoods, a sturdy barn, and a house built with his own hands. But now, after months away, the ranch looked as if it had been holding its breath. Weeds choked the yard, grass had grown knee-high around the corral, and the front gate sagged half-broken on its hinges. Even the air seemed still, carrying the scent of dry dust and faint wood rot. The older wife gazed at the property in silence, while the younger's eyes darted nervously over every shadow, as though she half expected someone to step out and challenge their arrival. They rode in slow, hooves crunching against the brittle earth. The barn door hung slightly ajar, swaying with a low groan in the evening wind. The cowboy dismounted, every sense sharpened, scanning the yard for signs of movement. When he pushed the barn door open, the familiar smell of hay and horse sweat hit him, but mingled with it was the distinct tang of smoke. Inside, the stalls were empty, yet a pile of hay looked freshly disturbed, and boot prints, not his, marked the dirt floor. They were large, deep-set, and recent. His stomach tightened. Someone had been here, maybe still was. They checked the house next. The windows were dusty, the shutters rattling faintly, yet the ashes in the stone hearth were fresh and still warm. The beds had been stripped bare, but one had an impression in the mattress, like a body had been there just last night. In the kitchen, a tin cup sat on the table beside a scrap of torn paper. The cowboy picked it up, intending to toss it into the stove, but froze when his eyes landed on the faded ink. A name written in a shaky hand, a name he recognized not from any Apache tongue, but from an old settler's roll call. It was the younger wife's name, Her first name, the one she'd said she barely remembered from her earliest years. This wasn't chance. Someone knew exactly who she was, and they'd been close enough to leave this behind. As night fell, the ranch seemed to grow smaller, hemmed in by the darkness beyond the fences. They ate in near silence, the older wife sitting close to the fire, the younger keeping her back to the wall, as if expecting trouble to burst through the door at any moment. The cowboy cleaned his rifle slowly, his mind spinning with questions. Who had been here? How had they known the girl's real name? And why leave it behind unless they wanted him to know? It was past midnight when the sound came, faint at first, then sharper. Hoofbeats. Not many, just one rider, moving with unhurried confidence down the moonlit trail to the ranch yard. The cowboy stepped outside, rifle in hand, boots crunching softly on the dirt. A tall man on a dark horse came into view, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a hat, the glint of something metallic at his belt. He pulled up short, his voice calm, almost casual. "I'll make this simple," the rider said, his words carrying in the cold night air. "Hand over the women. Both of them. Do that, and I'll leave you enough gold to buy this land twice over." The cowboy didn't answer right away. He studied the man's posture, the way he kept one hand resting on the pommel and the other near his revolver. Behind him, the house was silent, but he could feel the women's eyes watching from the doorway. Gold was tempting, more than he'd see in a lifetime, but the thought of them in this man's hands made his blood run hot. He spat into the dirt. "No deal," he said finally. "You tell whoever sent you that if they want him, they'll have to ride through me first." The rider's smile was thin, humorless. "Reckon that can be arranged." He tipped his hat and wheeled his horse around, disappearing into the shadows without a backward glance. The cowboy stood there for a long moment, the night pressing in around him. He knew this wasn't over. Whoever was after the women wasn't going to stop, not for gold, not for blood. And for the first time he realized this fight wasn't about some inheritance or dying man's wish. This was personal now. The night was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that presses against the skin and makes the air feel heavier than it should. The cowboy had been dozing in the corner chair by the kitchen window, his rifle resting against his leg, when he awoke to a sound he couldn't place. A faint rustle, the creak of an unlatched door. He stood slowly, every instinct telling him something wasn't right. When he stepped into the hallway, the cold air streaming in from the open front door confirmed his unease. The older wife was gone. Her blanket lay rumpled on the cot, a single feather from her hair ornament resting on the floor like a discarded clue. Outside, the ground was disturbed, not in the hurried scuffle of a fight, but in the deliberate steps of someone who left by choice, or perhaps under the false promise of safety. The younger wife was already awake, her face pale in the moonlight as she stood in the doorway. She had her shawl wrapped tight, and her eyes didn't wander to the darkness outside, they were fixed on him. "I think I know what happened," she whispered, her voice tight with something between fear and bitterness. She told him of whispered conversations she had overheard on the trail, words exchanged between the older wife and a shadowy figure who had followed them for days. The older woman had promised information, routes, weaknesses, plans, in return for a chance to bargain her own survival. She thought she could buy her safety, the younger wife said quietly, but men like that, they take more than you offer. Before the cowboy could respond, the distant beat of hooves carried through the night air. He stepped onto the porch and saw the glow of lanterns flickering along the ridge. They weren't riding away, they were encircling the ranch. He knew the pattern well, he'd used it himself once in another life in another kind of fight. By the time the riders were in position, the first rifle crack split the silence. The bullet tore into the upper beam of the barn, sending splinters into the dirt. The younger wife ducked, already moving toward the storage shed where their supplies were stashed. She returned with a coil of rope and a battered satchel filled with old nails, the glint in her eyes showing that she was not a stranger to the thought of survival. They moved quickly, the cowboy barking quiet orders as they worked. In the barn, they strung ropes across the wide doors at ankle height, scattering loose tools where a man might trip and fall. In the corral, they dug shallow pits, covering them with brush to hide the danger beneath. On the porch, they dragged an old wagon wheel into place, reinforcing the door with planks from the shed. Every creak of wood and hiss of rope felt amplified under the pounding in their chests. By the time the attackers closed in, the ranch had transformed into a fortress born of desperation and cunning. The first man to approach the barn went down hard, tangled in the rope trap and crashing into the dirt with a howl. Another tried to rush the porch but fell screaming into one of the hidden pits. The cowboy fired twice from the cover of the barn door, the muzzle flashes illuminating his set jaw and narrowed eyes. The younger wife, kneeling behind the porch rail, handled the old shotgun like it was an extension of her own arm, each blast sending a spray of buckshot into the darkness. The siege stretched on through the night. They moved like shadows, slipping from one position to another, keeping their attackers guessing. Every time a rifle cracked from the ridge, the cowboy answered with a sharper shot, making each bullet count. The younger wife never flinched, even when a round splintered the railing inches from her face. Her hair had come loose, falling across her cheeks, but her focus never wavered. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for something deeper, something that tied her fate to his in ways neither had yet spoken aloud. Hours passed and the enemy fire began to slow. The cowboy knew they weren't retreating out of mercy, they were regrouping. He was already counting the remaining bullets when movement caught his eye in the field beyond the barn. A lone figure was stumbling toward the ranch, clutching her side, her clothing torn and stained dark with blood. It was the older wife. She fell to her knees halfway across the yard, gasping for air before calling out to them. The younger wife was on her feet in an instant, but the cowboy held her back with a firm hand. They waited, rifles ready, until the woman was close enough to see her eyes, and the fury burning in them. Between ragged breaths, she explained what had happened. She had indeed tried to strike a deal, offering information to buy her life, but when she realized their true intent, to take them both and kill the cowboy, something inside her shifted. She had fought back, killing one of their scouts with his own knife before running through the darkness to return here. "I was wrong," she rasped, looking from the cowboy to the younger wife. "They'll kill us all if we don't end this tonight." Without another word, she handed the cowboy a pistol she'd taken from the dead man, and together they faced the ridge once more. The final attack came just before dawn. The enemy charged from two sides, trying to overwhelm the traps and cover, but they hadn't expected the older wife to be among the defenders. From the porch, she fired shot after shot, her voice hoarse as she shouted warnings. The younger wife covered the barn entrance, her aim sharp and unyielding. The cowboy moved between them like a ghost, his rifle a steady, unrelenting force. By the time the first rays of sun broke over the horizon, the ground beyond the ranch was littered with bodies and discarded weapons. The surviving attackers had fled, their retreat marked by the pounding of hooves fading into the hills. Smoke from the rifles hung in the still morning air, mingling with the scent of dust and sweat. The three of them stood in the yard, breathing hard, their eyes meeting in the quiet that followed. The cowboy didn't speak, but the look he gave the older wife held both judgment and something like respect. She had betrayed them, yes, but she had also returned when it mattered most. The younger wife glanced between them, her face unreadable, though her hand found the cowboy's without hesitation. Somewhere beyond the horizon their enemies would regroup, but for now the ranch still stood, and so did they. The air over the ranch still smelled of gunpowder and smoke. The sun had barely risen, but the ground was already littered with the remnants of the night's battle, broken arrows, spent cartridges and blood that soaked into the dry earth. The cowboy stood on the porch, his rifle leaning against the rail, his eyes scanning the horizon for any movement. The younger wife sat nearby, her hands trembling as she cleaned the barrel of her revolver, the strain of what they had endured etched deep into her face. The older wife had returned hours earlier, wounded yet alive, but now she sat apart from them, staring into the dying embers of the campfire as if wrestling with ghosts only she could see. Silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. It was then, in the stillness after the storm, that the cowboy spoke. His voice was quiet, almost uncertain, as he told them what the dying Apache leader had truly entrusted to him. It had never been only about protecting the women. The leader's last breath had carried a secret, the location of a hidden valley deep beyond the mountains, a place untouched by white settlers, where the tribe's last safe hunting grounds lay hidden. The older wife's eyes flickered in recognition, while the younger wife leaned forward, listening intently. It was sacred land, guarded for generations, and now its fate rested in the hands of a man who had been a stranger to their people only weeks before. The younger wife asked him why the leader had chosen him. The cowboy could only shrug, his voice heavy with humility. Maybe it was because he had no ties to the greedy ranchers or the corrupt lawmen who would strip the valley bare. Maybe it was because he had fought, without question, to defend those who weren't his by blood. Whatever the reason, the responsibility now weighed on him like the desert sun. He told them plainly, if word got out, the land would be lost forever. The older wife rose slowly, wincing at the pain in her side. Her face was hard, her tone guarded. She admitted that she had been tempted to bargain with the enemy for her own safety, but the moment she saw their cruelty, she had turned her gun on them instead. Still, she didn't belong here, she said. Her place was with what remained of her people, to tell them what had happened and perhaps, to lead them toward survival in her own way. Her words weren't bitter, but there was no warmth in them either. She had made her choice. The younger wife's decision came in silence. She didn't speak immediately, only stood and walked toward the cowboy. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw something unspoken, loyalty, gratitude, and a bond forged in fire and blood. She told him she had nowhere else to go, that her life before the tribe had been erased in violence, and her life with them had ended in loss. Here, on this neglected ranch, she could build something new. With him. It wasn't said as a plea but as a truth she had already accepted. That night, they buried the dead from both sides. The cowboy worked in silence, driving his shovel into the dry earth while the younger wife stood watch. The older wife helped until the pain in her wound forced her to stop. When the last grave was filled, they stood together under the cold stars, each knowing this was the final time they would all be in the same place. At dawn, the older wife mounted one of the surviving horses. She didn't say goodbye, only gave a brief nod, her face unreadable as she rode off toward the distant mountains. The cowboy and the younger wife watched her until she disappeared from sight. Neither spoke for a long time. The younger wife finally broke the silence, asking what would become of the hidden valley. The cowboy looked toward the horizon, the first rays of morning light cutting through the dust in the air. He told her he would keep the secret, no matter the cost, but he knew peace in the West never lasted. One day someone else would come looking, for gold, for land, for power, and they would have to fight again. For now the ranch was theirs. It was quiet but not safe. The fences needed mending, the barn needed repair, and the land needed to be worked before winter came. The younger wife rolled up her sleeves and began clearing the debris from the yard, while the cowboy took to the fields, already planning where to start the planting. They didn't speak much, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Whatever storms came next, they would face them together. As the sun climbed higher, the cowboy paused to take in the view, the endless sky, the wind in the grass, and the faint line of the mountains beyond which lay the hidden valley. Somewhere out there, the older wife was riding toward her people, and somewhere beyond that, the world was changing faster than anyone could stop. But for now, in that fragile moment, the ranch stood and so did they. And in the West, sometimes that was all you could ask for.